I arrived at the Rosemont Club 40 minutes early, the November air sharp against my face as I walked through the mahogany doors. The historic Manhattan venue stretched before me, with its crystal chandeliers and marble floors, every surface polished to perfection for my father's retirement party. Waiters in crisp white shirts moved between tables, adjusting silverware and folding napkins into perfect triangles. "James, you made it," called Terrell Brooks, balancing a tray of champagne glasses. We'd met at a coffee shop near Columbia, where he was finishing his master's in social work. He had no idea who I really was, just that I seemed like a decent guy who occasionally helped him with catering gigs. "Need a hand?" I asked, rolling up the sleeves of my simple navy button-down. It wasn't expensive, nothing like the tailored suits that would fill this room in an hour, but it was clean and comfortable. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. "You're a lifesaver," Terrell grinned, handing me a cloth. "These glasses won't polish themselves." I settled into the familiar rhythm of work, wiping water spots from crystal stems while guests began trickling in, corporate executives in $1,000 suits, board members with their wives dripping in jewelry, all here to celebrate Raymond Lynn's 35 years climbing the corporate ladder at Chen Industries, one of New York's largest conglomerates. My father entered with his usual commanding presence, his silver hair perfectly styled, his charcoal suit immaculate. Behind him walked Sophia, my older sister, radiant in a red dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. She worked in public relations and carried herself like she owned every room she entered. "Raymond!" boomed a voice across the room. "There's the man of the hour." My father's face lit up as he shook hands with Martin Chen's nephew, David. "Thank you for coming. I want you to meet someone very special." He placed his hand on Sophia's shoulder with obvious pride. "This is my daughter, Sophia. She's the rising star at Whitman & Associates, handling PR for some of the biggest tech firms in the city." Sophia beamed, extending her hand with practiced grace. "The pleasure's mine. Dad's told me so much about the Chen family's vision for the future." I continued polishing glasses, invisible in plain sight. This was how it always worked. Sophia was the success story, the one who made sense to people like my father. Ambitious, polished, climbing ladders with purpose and style. "And who's this young man?" David asked, noticing me for the first time. My father glanced over, his expression shifting slightly. "Oh, that's James, my younger son. He does odd jobs. Part-time waiter, you know how it is with kids these days." The words hit like ice water, but I kept my face neutral, focusing on the glass in my hands. Just another waiter. That's all I was to him. The evening progressed with the predictable rhythm of corporate celebration. I moved between the kitchen and the main hall, carrying trays and clearing tables while the real guests settled into their roles. My phone buzzed against my leg, a text from Claire Vasquez, my mentor and the COO of our subsidiary. "Martin's en route. Big moment incoming." I slipped the phone back into my pocket, my pulse quickening slightly. Tonight was supposed to be about my father, but apparently the universe had other plans. The room fell quiet as my father approached the microphone at the front of the room. He adjusted his tie with the confidence of a man who'd spent decades commanding attention in boardrooms. "Friends, colleagues, family," he began, his voice carrying easily across the room. 35 years ago, I walked into Chen Industries as a young man with nothing but determination and a dream to build something meaningful. I paused near the back wall, a tray of empty glasses in my hands, watching as he painted the picture of his rise from factory floor to middle management. It was a good story, one of genuine hard work and perseverance. I'd always admired that about him, even when he couldn't see past his own definitions of success. "My daughter Sophia represents everything I hope to pass on to the next generation," he continued, gesturing toward her with obvious pride. "She's building bridges between innovation and communication, making sure the world understands the value of what we create." Sophia glowed under the attention, graciously nodding to the applause. She caught my eye across the room and gave me a smile that looked supportive but felt condescending. Later, as guests mingled during the cocktail hour, she approached me with that same expression. "James, you look good," she said, adjusting an invisible wrinkle in my shirt. "I'm glad you could make it tonight. It means a lot to Dad, even if he doesn't always show it." "I'm sure it does," I replied quietly. "And, at least you're staying busy with work. That's what matters, right? Keeping your hands moving, staying productive." She sipped her champagne, her eyes scanning the room for more important conversations. "Maybe someday you'll find something more substantial, something Dad can really brag about." I nodded, letting her words wash over me without response. Terrell appeared at my elbow, offering me a glass of water. "These fancy parties can be overwhelming," he said quietly, assuming I was another temporary worker feeling out of place. "But the people are just people, Some of them forget that, but it doesn't change what's true." His kindness caught me off guard. Here was someone who treated me with genuine respect, who saw me as a person worth talking to, while my own family... My phone buzzed again. "Claire, stay visible. He'll be here in 10. I straightened my shoulders, suddenly aware that everything was about to change. Martin Chen entered the Rosemont Club with the quiet authority of a man who'd built empires without raising his voice. At 72, he moved with the careful grace of someone who understood that power didn't need to announce itself. The room's energy shifted immediately. Conversations became more animated, laughter more polished, everyone suddenly aware they were in the presence of true influence. My father was among the first to approach him, his earlier confidence now mixed with the deference of a longtime employee greeting his ultimate superior. "Martin, thank you so much for coming," my father said, extending his hand with practiced warmth. "This means more than I can express." "Raymond, the pleasure is mine. 35 years of dedicated service deserves recognition." Martin's eyes scanned the room as they spoke, and I felt my stomach tighten when his gaze found mine across the crowded space. He excused himself from my father's conversation and began walking directly toward me, past clusters of executives and board members, past Sophia, who was mid-sentence with a group of impressed guests. The room seemed to quiet as people noticed the company's chairman bypassing important conversations to speak with someone they assumed was part of the catering staff. "James," Martin said warmly, extending his hand to me, "I'm so glad you could make it tonight." Quote. I set down my tray and shook his hand, acutely aware of the dozens of pairs of eyes now focused on us. "Mr. Chen, thank you for coming." "Are you kidding? I wouldn't miss the chance to publicly thank you for taking on the CEO role so seamlessly. The board is thrilled with the direction you're taking the innovation division." The words hung in the air like a dropped glass, sharp and impossible to ignore. I heard someone's sharp intake of breath, saw my father's face go completely blank, watched Sophia's champagne glass stop halfway to her lips. Martin continued, as if he hadn't just detonated a bomb in the middle of my father's retirement party. "The AI applications your team developed are already being implemented across 3 continents. The education sector alone is projecting a 40% improvement in learning outcomes." "Thank you, sir," I managed, my voice steady, despite the chaos I could feel building around us. "The team has worked incredibly hard." Teams follow leaders, James, and you've proven that leadership doesn't always come with the loudest voice. I could see my father in my peripheral vision, his mouth slightly open, his carefully constructed evening suddenly making no sense. Sophia had recovered enough to approach us, her PR training kicking in even as her world tilted off its axis. "I'm sorry," she said with her most charming smile. "I don't think we've been properly introduced. I'm Sophia Lynn, James's sister." Martin turned to her with polite attention. "Of course, Raymond's daughter. James has mentioned your work in public relations. It's nice to finally meet you." The phrase "James has mentioned" landed like another small explosion. Since when did James mention anything to the chairman of Chen Industries? Since when did the chairman of Chen Industries know James well enough to have casual conversations about family? Claire Vasquez appeared at my side like a guardian angel, her presence immediately legitimizing the surreal moment unfolding in the middle of my father's party. At 55, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd earned her place in rooms full of men who initially underestimated her. "Martin, James," she nodded to us both before turning to address the small crowd that had gathered around us. "I hope you don't mind me interrupting, but I wanted to make sure everyone understood the significance of what James has built over the past 3 years." Quote, my father moved closer, his face a mixture of confusion and growing concern. Sophia positioned herself where she could hear every word, her PR instincts recognizing a narrative spinning out of her control. "The stealth mode subsidiary James launched has generated over $200 million in revenue," Claire continued, her voice carrying the authority of someone presenting quarterly reports to board members. "More importantly, the educational technology his team developed is being used in underserved schools across 43 states." A murmur rippled through the crowd. These were people who understood numbers, who respected innovation, who could recognize genuine achievement when it was laid out in clear terms. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "But James insisted on keeping his role quiet," Claire added, glancing at me with something that looked like protective pride. "He wanted the work to speak for itself, without the complications of family connections or corporate politics." I watched my father's face as the implications sank in. James, his disappointing younger son who couldn't seem to find direction, had been running a division of the same company where Raymond had spent 35 years climbing from factory floor to middle management. James, the part-time waiter he'd just dismissed in front of colleagues, was operating at a level Raymond had never reached. Guests began approaching me directly now, introducing themselves, asking questions about the technology, the implementation, the vision for expansion. I found myself in conversations about artificial intelligence applications, about educational equity, about the responsibility of innovation to serve community needs. "James," called Margaret Steinberg, a board member I'd worked with on budget allocations, "could you tell us more about the partnerships with public school systems?" As I began explaining the pilot programs, I caught sight of my father trying to engage Martin in private conversation near the bar. Martin listened politely but kept his responses brief, his attention clearly focused on the larger gathering around me. Sophia stood at the edge of our group, her usual centrality to family events suddenly displaced. For the first time in her life, she was watching someone else command the room's attention, someone who shared her last name but not her approach to success. My phone remained quiet now. No more messages from Claire about timing or preparation. The moment she'd been orchestrating had arrived, and I was standing in the middle of it, no longer invisible, no longer dismissible. Martin appeared at my elbow during a brief lull in questions. "James, would you be willing to say a few words to the group? I think people would appreciate hearing your perspective on leadership and innovation." It wasn't really a request. In that moment, I realized this entire evening had been orchestrated not just as my father's retirement celebration, but as my public introduction to the wider corporate community. The choice was mine. Continue letting others speak for me, or finally claim my own voice. The room gradually quieted as Martin guided me toward the small stage where my father had delivered his retirement speech an hour earlier. I could feel every eye in the room tracking my movement, the weight of expectations and curiosity pressing against my shoulders. Standing behind the microphone, I looked out at faces that ranged from genuinely interested to politely confused to barely concealed skeptical. My father sat in the front row, his hands folded tightly in his lap, his expression unreadable. Sophia stood near the back, her phone discreetly positioned to record the PR professional in her recognizing a moment that might need managing later. 3 years ago, I began, my voice finding its rhythm in the familiar cadence of explaining complex ideas simply. I was sitting in a coffee shop in Queens, watching a 7-year-old girl struggle with her math homework while her mother worked a double shift at the table next to her. The room was completely still now, the kind of attention usually reserved for quarterly earnings reports or merger announcements. I realized that all the technology in the world meant nothing if it couldn't reach the people who needed it most. So I started building something small, just an app that could adapt to different learning styles, that could provide extra support for kids whose parents were working multiple jobs to keep the lights on. I could see Claire nodding encouragingly from her position near the kitchen doors, and Terrell, still technically working but clearly listening, offered me a subtle thumbs up. The business world talks a lot about disruption and innovation, but I think we sometimes forget that the most powerful innovations are the ones that make life a little easier for people who don't have time to figure out complicated systems. The ones that work quietly in the background, solving problems without creating new ones. My father's expression had shifted from confusion to something that looked like recognition, as if he was seeing me clearly for the first time in years. The team I work with, engineers, designers, educators, social workers, they've taught me that leadership isn't about having the loudest voice in the room. It's about creating space for other people's expertise, about building systems that amplify everyone's contributions rather than diminishing them. I paused, my eyes finding Martin's face in the crowd. He was smiling with what looked like paternal pride, and I understood suddenly that this moment wasn't just about my father's retirement or my professional reveal. It was about mentorship. About someone who'd seen potential and patiently waited for the right moment to help it emerge. Tonight is supposed to be about celebrating my father's 35 years of dedicated service to Chen Industries. He taught me that showing up consistently, treating colleagues with respect, and taking pride in your work are the foundations of any meaningful career. I've tried to build on those foundations while finding my own path forward. The applause started quietly and built to something that felt genuinely appreciative rather than merely polite. As I stepped away from the microphone, several people approached immediately, not to network or position themselves, but to continue conversations about education access, about technology ethics, about the responsibility of profitable companies to serve public good. But I could see my father still sitting in his chair, staring at his hands, and I knew that the real conversation of the evening was yet to come. The party wound down gradually, guests filtering out into the Manhattan night, with business cards exchanged and new connections made. I helped Terrell clear the remaining glasses and stack chairs, falling back into the comfortable anonymity of cleanup work while processing everything that had happened. Sophia had left early, pleading an important client call, but really, I suspected, needing time to recalibrate her understanding of family dynamics. Martin had shaken my hand warmly before departing, mentioning a board meeting next week where I'd be presenting expansion plans to the full executive committee. I was pulling on my jacket when my father appeared in the doorway, his earlier commanding presence replaced by something more uncertain. "James," he said quietly, could we talk for a minute?" Outside, the November air was sharp enough to cut through the evening's wine and confusion, leaving both of us more sober than we'd been an hour earlier. The street was quieter now, just the occasional taxi and the distant hum of a city that never fully slept. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, and there was something raw in his voice that I'd never heard before. "Tell you what, exactly?" That you had built." He gestured vaguely, struggling to find words for something that didn't fit his understanding of how careers worked. "That you were running a division of the company I've worked for my entire adult life." I looked at him for a long moment, this man who'd raised me with clear expectations about success and achievement, who'd measured my worth by metrics that had never made sense to me. "When would I have told you, Dad, at Sunday dinners where you asked what I was really going to do with my life? During phone calls where you suggested I apply for entry-level positions at firms where your friends could put in good words for me?" "You embarrassed me tonight," he said, but the words lacked conviction. "I embarrassed you? You introduced me to your colleagues as a part-time waiter. You dismissed me in front of people whose respect you've spent decades earning. I thought you were wasting your potential. I thought you were—" He trailed off, perhaps finally hearing how his assumptions sounded when spoken aloud. "You thought I was failing because I wasn't wearing the right clothes, or carrying the right business cards, or climbing the right ladders in the right order." I kept my voice level, not angry but tired. "You never looked past the surface to see what I was actually building." We stood in silence for several minutes, the weight of years of misunderstanding settling between us like snow. "I wanted to be proud of you," he said finally. "You never needed my permission for that, Dad. You just needed to look past the suit." He nodded slowly, something shifting in his expression. Not forgiveness exactly, and not full understanding, but maybe the beginning of willingness to see things differently. "The education programs," he said. "The ones that woman mentioned? Claire? We're implementing them in 1,200 schools next semester. Kids who are falling behind in math are testing at grade level. Teachers have more time to focus on creative instruction instead of just drilling basics." Another long pause. Then, "That sounds like something worth doing." "It is?" He turned to leave, then stopped. "James, would you be willing to show me what you've built? Not as your father necessarily, but as someone who might finally be ready to learn something new?" For the first time all evening, I smiled without reservation. "I'd like that, Dad." Back in my apartment in Lower Manhattan, a one-bedroom space that was comfortable rather than impressive, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and finally allowed myself to process the evening's events. The contrast between the elegant Rosemont Club and my simple home felt appropriate somehow, like stepping back into my own skin after wearing a costume. My phone showed 17 missed calls, 43 text messages, and 62 emails. Word traveled fast in corporate circles, apparently. I scrolled through messages from board members, industry contacts, and reporters who'd somehow gotten wind of the story. Most could wait until tomorrow. But there was one envelope slipped under my door that I opened immediately, recognizing my grandmother's careful handwriting. "My dear James," it began in her mix of English and Chinese characters that always made me feel like a child again. "I watched the news tonight. Very proud, but not surprised. Nai always knew you were building something important, even when you thought no one was paying attention." She went on to describe watching my segment on the local business news, how she'd called her friends to tell them about her grandson, the CEO. But then her tone shifted to something more serious. "Your father called me tonight, very confused, very upset with himself. He asked me if I knew about your work, if you had told me what you hadn't told him. I said yes. James shared with me because I listened without judgment, without trying to fix or change or improve. Sometimes that's all children need, even grown children." I set the letter down, my throat tight. Nai had indeed been my closest confidant throughout the past 3 years. The one person who'd understood my need for privacy, who'd celebrated my successes quietly without needing to broadcast them to the world. My phone buzzed with a text from Terrell. "Saw the news, man. You never said you were the boss. Respect." Another buzz. "This is Sophia. Are you mad at us? Can we talk?" I deleted Sophia's message without responding and texted Terrell back. "Still the same person. Still happy to help polish glasses when you need it." Over the next hour, I read through messages from team members expressing support, from former colleagues congratulating me on the public recognition, from strangers who'd heard about the education programs and wanted to share their own stories of kids who'd benefited from accessible technology. But the message that made me sit back in my chair came from Martin Chen. "James, tonight was long overdue. Your father is lucky to have you as a son, even if it took him a while to realize it. Looking forward to Monday's presentation. The board is excited to hear your 5-year vision." 5-year vision. I'd been so focused on building quietly, on proving that the work itself was valuable, that I hadn't fully considered what came next. Now apparently I needed to think bigger, to plan for scale and growth and the kind of impact that required more than stealth mode operations. I opened my laptop and began sketching out ideas, not for the presentation, but for conversations with my father, for ways to bridge the gap between his understanding of success and mine, for the possibility that family dynamics could evolve the same way technology did, slowly, then suddenly, then permanently. Outside my window, Manhattan hummed with its constant energy, millions of people building their own quiet empires, solving their own problems, creating their own definitions of achievement. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new chances to prove that leadership didn't always require a spotlight. Tonight, though, I was content to sit in my small apartment, surrounded by evidence that sometimes the most important work happened in the spaces between what others could see. The following Monday, my father appeared in the lobby of our downtown office building 10 minutes early, wearing a suit I'd never seen before and carrying a leather portfolio that looked brand new. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I watched him examine the company directory, running his finger down the list until he found Chen Industries Innovation Division, Floor 23. I met him at the elevator, noting how he stood a little straighter when other employees nodded respectfully in my direction. "Thank you for coming," I said as we rode up together. "Thank you for inviting me." The 23rd floor was a study in intentional design. Open workspaces that encouraged collaboration, quiet corners for focused thinking, a kitchen area where people actually gathered to share ideas over coffee. Everything about the space reflected values rather than status, function rather than impression. "James," called Elena Martinez, our lead UX designer, as we walked past her desk. "Perfect timing. I wanted to show you the user feedback from the Pittsburgh pilot." I introduced my father as we paused to look at Elena's screen, which displayed a dashboard of metrics that would have made any executive proud: engagement rates, learning outcome improvements, teacher satisfaction scores. "This is incredible work," my father said quietly, studying the data with the attention of someone who'd spent decades analyzing performance reports. "Elena's team designed the entire interface based on feedback from actual teachers and students," I explained. "We spent 6 months in classrooms before writing a single line of code." As we continued the tour, I introduced him to Marcus Chen, our deaf software developer who'd revolutionized our accessibility features, to Sarah Williams, a single mother finishing her PhD in educational psychology while leading our research division, to Tommy Rodriguez, 19 years old and already designing AI systems that university professors were calling groundbreaking. Each introduction revealed another layer of intentionality in how we'd built the team. These weren't just talented people. They were people whose lived experiences informed their work, whose personal stakes in solving problems made them better at their jobs. In the conference room, Claire had prepared a presentation that walked through our impact metrics. 340,000 students using our educational apps, average test score improvements of 23%, teacher retention rates in partner schools up 15% compared to district averages. But it was the wall of thank you letters that stopped my father in his tracks. Hundreds of handwritten notes from children, drawings from art students, photos from graduation ceremonies where kids who'd struggled academically were now heading to college. He stood there for several minutes, reading letter after letter, his expression shifting from professional interest to something deeper. "Dear Mr. James," read one letter in careful second-grade handwriting, "thank you for making math fun. I used to cry when Mom helped me with homework, but now I can do fractions by myself, and she says she's proud of me." Another, from a teenager, "I never thought I was smart enough for computer programming until your app showed me that there are different ways to learn. I got accepted to MIT early admission, and I wanted you to know that you changed my life." "Jesus, James," my father said finally, his voice rough. "You've built something real." It wasn't the approval I'd been seeking. I'd learned to find validation in the work itself, rather than in other people's recognition. But hearing him understand, finally, what I'd been working toward felt like a weightlifting that I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. "We've built something real," I corrected gently, "and we're just getting started." As we prepared to leave, he turned to me with an expression I'd never seen before, not pride exactly, but respect. "Would it be appropriate for me to attend your board presentation tomorrow? Not to interfere, just to learn." I smiled, thinking of all the years I'd waited for him to be curious about my work rather than critical of my choices. "I'd like that, Dad. I'd like that a lot." The Chen Industries boardroom occupied the entire 38th floor, its windows offering a panoramic view of Manhattan that reminded everyone present of the scale of decisions made in this space. 24 executives sat around a table that had hosted conversations shaping industries, launching products, and determining the economic futures of thousands of employees. I'd presented to this group before, but always as the quietly competent leader of a subsidiary division, someone whose work they appreciated but didn't necessarily see as central to the company's identity. Today felt different, not because my role had changed, but because the context around it had shifted. Martin Chen opened the meeting with the efficiency of someone who'd been running board meetings for 4 decades. Before we dive into quarterly reports, I want James Lin to present his 5-year vision for the Innovation Division. As you all know by now, James has been running this operation with remarkable success, while maintaining the kind of discretion we should all admire. I stood, my presentation materials ready, but my focus on the people around the table, executives who controlled budgets, who made strategic decisions, who could either support expansion or constrain it based on their understanding of what we were building. 5 years from now, I began, I want a child in rural Mississippi to have access to the same quality educational technology as a child in Manhattan. I want teachers in underfunded schools to have tools that amplify their expertise rather than replacing it. I want parents working multiple jobs to know their kids are getting personalized learning support even when homework help isn't available at home. The room was attentive in a way that felt different from typical corporate presentations. These were people accustomed to hearing about market penetration and profit margins, but I was talking about something that connected business success to social impact. The financial projections support aggressive expansion, I continued, clicking through slides that showed revenue growth, market analysis, and competitive positioning. But more importantly, we have evidence that this work scales effectively. Every metric that matters, learning outcomes, teacher satisfaction, family engagement, improves when we implement our programs thoughtfully. During the Q&A period, Margaret Steinberg asked about international expansion. David Chen wanted to understand integration with existing company operations. Sarah Liu, the newest board member, pushed me on accessibility features for students with disabilities. These were sophisticated questions from people who understood both the business implications and the social responsibility of what we were building. I answered each one directly, drawing on 3 years of data and experience rather than theoretical projections. Halfway through the presentation, I noticed my father slip into the back of the room. He sat quietly in an observer's chair, taking notes in the same careful handwriting I remembered from childhood homework sessions. When Sophia arrived 20 minutes late, her usual confident entrance subdued by the realization that she was walking into a presentation rather than a casual meeting, I acknowledged her with a professional nod and continued discussing implementation timelines. Near the end of my presentation, my father raised his hand from the back of the room. The gesture was humble, appropriate, not demanding attention but asking permission to participate. Raymond? Martin acknowledged him with surprise and interest. I wanted to ask about sustainability, my father said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades thinking about long-term business strategy. These are impressive results, but how do you ensure the programs remain effective as they scale? How do you maintain quality when you're reaching hundreds of thousands of students instead of hundreds? It was a sophisticated question, the kind that demonstrated he'd been paying attention not just to the presentation, but to the underlying challenges of sustainable growth. I answered it thoroughly, explaining our quality assurance protocols, our teacher training programs, our feedback systems that allowed continuous improvement. When the formal presentation ended, board members approached with follow-up questions, partnership proposals, and expressions of support for expanded funding. But the moment that mattered most to me was watching my father shake hands with colleagues who'd known him for decades, all of them now understanding that his son was leading work they considered essential to the company's future. As people filed out of the boardroom, Martin caught my attention. James, excellent work today. The board is enthusiastic about full expansion funding. Thank you, sir. And Raymond, he added, turning to my father, it's good to see you here. James is lucky to have family support. My father looked at me, then back at Martin. I'm the one who's been lucky, he said quietly. I just took a while to figure that out. Nai's apartment in Queens occupied the 3rd floor of a building that had housed 3 generations of immigrant families, each group adding their own layers to the neighborhood's character. The walls of her small dining room were covered with photographs spanning 60 years, Wedding pictures, graduations, holiday celebrations, and the countless small moments that make up a family's shared history. She had insisted on cooking, despite my offers to bring takeout or cater something simple. The table was covered with dishes that represented hours of careful preparation: dumplings folded by hand, vegetables stir-fried with the precision of decades of practice, soup that simmered with ingredients I couldn't identify, but flavors that tasted like childhood. My father arrived 15 minutes early, carrying flowers and wearing a sweater instead of his usual suit, a small gesture that somehow signaled his willingness to step outside the formal roles that had defined our relationship for so long. Sophia came directly from work, still in her professional attire but carrying a bottle of wine in what looked like genuine nervousness. She'd been uncharacteristically quiet since the board meeting, her usual confidence shaken by the realization that family dynamics were more complex than she'd understood. "Sit, Nai directed us, her small frame commanding the kind of respect that had nothing to do with physical presence and everything to do with earned authority. "James, you help serve. Sophia, you pour drinks. Raymond, you tell me about this retirement party everyone is talking about." As we settled into the familiar rhythm of a family meal, the conversation gradually moved away from work and corporate achievements toward more fundamental things. Nai told stories about her early years in New York, about learning English while working 2 jobs and raising children, about the quiet perseverance required to build a life in a place that didn't always welcome newcomers. "During the winter of 1963, she said, ladling soup into our bowls, there was a rice shortage in our neighborhood. Everyone was worried, fighting over what was available. But I remembered something from growing up in China. Sometimes the best way to grow rice is to plant it in the quiet corners, where no one expects it to flourish." She looked directly at me as she spoke, and I understood that this wasn't just a story about rice. "James reminds me of that season," she continued. "Quiet, patient, but full of life. Growing something important where others weren't paying attention." The table fell silent for a moment, the weight of her words settling among us like a blessing. Sophia set down her chopsticks and looked across the table at me. "James, I owe you an apology." Her voice was softer than I'd heard it in years, stripped of its usual PR polish. "I spent so much time thinking I understood success, thinking I knew what achievement looked like, that I never saw what you were actually accomplishing." "Sophia." "No, let me finish. I was embarrassed by you because you didn't fit the image I thought our family should project. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." My father had been quiet throughout most of the meal, listening more than speaking, observing family dynamics with the attention of someone learning to see familiar things from new angles. Finally, he raised his small glass of wine. "I want to make a toast," he said, "not to the company, not to achievements or recognition, but to James's heart." He paused, struggling with words that didn't come naturally to someone more comfortable with quarterly reports than emotional expression. "I spent 35 years climbing ladders, measuring success by titles and salaries, and the respect of colleagues I barely knew. I thought that was what mattered, what I should teach my children to value." He looked at me directly. "You found a better way, and I'm proud of you for having the courage to build something that matters." We drank the toast in the warm light of Nai's dining room, surrounded by photographs of family members who'd built their own quiet legacies, who'd measured success by different standards than corporate hierarchies and professional recognition. Later, as we cleared dishes and prepared to leave, my phone buzzed with a text from Terrell. "You free next week? Could use help with a catering gig if you're not too busy bossing people around." I showed the message to Nai, who laughed with the delight of someone who understood that the best kind of success never required you to stop being yourself. "Tell him yes," she said, patting my hand with fingers that had folded thousands of dumplings, that had built a life through quiet persistence and careful attention to what mattered most. "Tell him you're never too important to help a friend." Outside, as we said goodbye on the street corner where 3 generations of our family had learned to navigate the space between tradition and innovation, I realized that I'd finally found what I'd been building toward all along. Not just a successful company or recognition from colleagues, but a place at the table where being myself was enough. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.